it cold out today. -2 is what it is right at the moment, with a wind chill, I think, a -25 right in that range. North Pole today, 12 degrees. So the level in Colorado is well below the temperature of what North Pole is today. So anyway, today, electrical connector. First of all, I'll cover the tools using. Got my side cutters here. I've had these since I was about 14 years old. I bought them new. They're made by Duro Industries. This is a set of Lyman's pliers, and these are a 50-7 Crescent. My dad bought these right after he came back from World War II, and I inherited those. My wire strippers here, just a cheap pair. I have no clue. It's just that I like using those more than any of the other wire strippers I've got. So that's why I use those. I've got my cheap plastic welder right here, and I'll show you why I'm using that here in just a moment. So I think to start with, I'm going to show you these. And when they first came out, I was really happy about them, and I quickly grew to where I realized that it took me longer to use these than to do it the way I've always done it. So that's what I'm going to show you how to do it. But before we go any further than that, if you're using those connectors, these ones, let me cover that really quick because you don't know. This clear part is shrink tubing. The blue part is a hot glue that melts down onto the wire and seals it. And this is solder here that melts when you heat it up. So this is one that's cut apart, and there was no flux put on the wire because you're not supposed to need to do that. And you can see that the flow of solder out into the copper wire is really, really poor on that. And I got these really hot. You can see there, you know, I got some heat to it, but I just gonna get the the solder to flow as well as I'd like. So I put some flux, dipped the wires into some flux before I inserted them into that connector, and I did the same thing, and you can see how nicely that flowed. These are crushed down a little bit just from me cutting it in half, but that's how well that the solder flowed out into the copper, and you can see that I didn't get those hot like I did the other ones. So if you're using these connectors, make sure you use some flux on your bare copper wire before you insert it into your connector. All right, so with that, I'm going to show you how I go about this. So this is one that I've done, but I on purposely did this so you could see that there's a mistake right there. Anytime you see a joint like this and you see a bump in it, you need to redo that, because that will eventually wear through. In fact, where I did the heat shrink on tubing on that, it feels to me like it's solder that's right there that's sticking through. So you'd have a short right there if it rubbed up against anything. So I say if you see a joint that's like that, it needs to be redone. All right, so with that, we're gonna do this real quickly. I'm just gonna use the same wire. Cut it off, and we'll strip some insulation off. I'll probably take a little more than I normally do, just for demonstration purposes on that, so you can see the joint a little bit better. All right, so I'm going to take this, and I'm going to dip it into some, this is just a universal flux here. I normally you would use gloves when I'm messing with this stuff, because I have a tendency when I'm done is to rub my eyes, and it gets into my eyeballs and it hurts. But I'll make sure I don't do that. Boy, the old stuff that was around when I was a kid that was a flux, it was true acid. It would hurt when you got it on your hands. Back in those days, men didn't wear protective gloves. They wore leather gloves, but they didn't have any latex gloves to wear. So there's my joint right there. I'll tighten that up a little more here, like that. So that's the joint. All right. So I'm putting my holder right here. Pull this stuff out of the way. I'm going to take cut a piece of solder off here. I use 60/40. I don't use rosin pour. Either way is fine if you're using Flux. Okay, I'm going to turn on my welder here. We're going to solder with this. There we go. That's making noise. I'll try to talk over this. Show you our next thing. So I like using an uninsulated terminal like this, but they're a lot more expensive and harder to come by than insulated. So I just simply take the insulated ones and I pull the insulation off. Comes off real easy. And here in just a minute, I'll show you what we're going to do with that. In fact, we'll strip a piece of wire off here while we're waiting. I'll take this, pull that off of there. Dip it into some Flux. And I'll take my terminal here. Shorten it up a little bit there. We'll take our terminal and put it in there like that. And then we'll solder that here in a minute. I'll show you how it works so well with the welder. Okay. That's all there is to doing a joint like that. And like I say, you just want to make sure you don't have anything sticking out that will penetrate that. And looking at that, I did not get a good flow on that backside. That's a good demonstration though. See, I didn't get it to flow out well enough on that backside. So I'm going to go ahead and do that one here real quick. A little bit more Flux in there. Turn the noise maker on. All right, so here is our final on this thing. You can see we got solder flowed through it, and it's smooth all the way around, so there won't be anything sticking out like I showed you in that other demonstration. I'm going to cut off a piece of heat shrink. I use 1/4 inch heat shrink on most everything I do in automotive, unless you're dealing with really heavy gauge stuff. So I'll square this up. But I usually use on a joint like this about 1.5 inches. So we'll take that. So I buy that in bulk in a 100-foot roll, and it's 1/4 inch, and it shrinks 2 times its size. You can get stuff that shrinks more than that, but this seems to work really well for me. So that's what we're looking at. So I just use the welder. And that is all there is to it. Right there, and that's a good strong joint. It'll have no resistance to it, and it'll work really well for many decades. So after I made this video, I realized that I should have shown showing the amount of penetration that the solder had into the copper, which is 100%, as you can see there. So I just want to show that. Also, I had a question about whether this would break in half if it gets any pressure on it or sits and has any movement at all. But no, it will not. I've never had one of these fail. I mean, I learned soldering, not the way I'm soldering this really, but with a soldering iron when I first started this 5 decades ago. I've never remember having a solder joint fail. But I do know there's a video out there from a big box place, I'm not going to name them, that the guy is really bragging up crimp connectors. I have nothing against crimp connectors, and we're going to do a video on that also. But when he did that, he grabbed this and started moving it back and forth. Now he was not breaking the solder joint, but rather the copper after the solder joint. And so he just in fact, I don't know, he might have, they might have edited that video, but he did this and it broke right off. And I can do it too, and I can also do it with any other joint right there. See, I broke that in half, but you can see it did not break at the solder joint. It broke after that onto the copper. And so you could have a crimp joint, and it's going to do the same exact thing. So I just wanted to add these two things to the video because I had a couple questions about that. Now let's talk real quick about, before I go on to the next one, and then we'll be finished after that, is the plastic welder. Now this is just a cheap Harbor Freight one that I got, but I really like this is because when you use a heat gun and you're up underneath the dash or under the hood, you're like trying to melt everything, where this it directs it just exactly where you want it. I have some heat shields that I've made that I can either use put on magnetically or use with a vice grip that it will deflect heat as well if I'm in a really tight spot and there's a lot of stuff I don't want to get hot. But I started using this with heat shrink, and then eventually I figured out that I could solder with it as well, and it worked really well. And you're going to see in this next demonstration that it works really, really well for putting on these terminals. So that's the next thing we're going to do. So here's the terminal I showed you earlier, and I got Flux on there. It doesn't hurt to dip your terminal in a little bit of Flux as well, and then just put it up on your wire. Like that. I'll put it here in the holder. Okay. So now I'll turn on my welder. So then I got that insulation a little too warm there time, but there it is, and you can see that when you're using that, it just blows that solder right down that terminal and right down into the wire, and it just makes a nice solid piece. I'm gonna have to cut this off of here so I can put a piece of heat shrink on there. I just use a little short piece of heat shrink usually on these, like this. And that is how that turns out, just like that, which is really nice. I did get that insulation a little hot on there. Usually a little bit more careful with that, but I was in a bit of a hurry to get this done for the video, so you didn't have to watch me for an extended period of time, and I did get that a little warm. But even so, it doesn't really make a whole lot of difference because we got the insulation on there. All right, so that covers, I think, everything I wanted to on that. So with that, I guess, thanks for watching the video. Hope you learned a little something from me, and have a blessed day.